A female bonobo drops out of a fruiting tree in the Congo Basin and walks straight toward a rival group that has just crossed into her community's feeding range. 12 animals face off across a gap of perhaps 20 feet of undergrowth. Every hair on both sides is already standing up. Screaming calls are bouncing between the trees, the exact sound that, in a chimpanzee forest 400 miles to the north, would be the opening minute of a border killing. The kind of encounter that has ended, in documented cases elsewhere on the continent, with a male beaten to death by a rival coalition within the hour. She does not bare her teeth. She does not charge. She presses her body against a stranger for a few seconds, breaks contact, and walks on. The screaming stops. 90 seconds later, animals from two groups that had been threatening each other across the clearing are picking fruit from the same branches, closer to each other than a chimpanzee from either community would tolerate for a single second. Every other great ape on the planet treats a moment like this as the first move of a potential war. Chimpanzee males patrol their borders in silent, single file, and when they outnumber a rival group, killings follow, sometimes within minutes. Gorilla silverbacks fight to the point of broken fingers and torn ears over access to females. But in this species, genetically closer to humans than almost anything else alive, aggression is being managed by something else entirely. Today we are going to find out why bonobos, one of our two closest living relatives, built sex into the machinery of peacekeeping, and how a species that should, by every rule of primate politics, be as violent as its cousin the chimpanzee, ended up running its whole society on the opposite principle. Bonobos, scientific name Pan-paniscus, exist only south of the Congo River, across a stretch of lowland rainforest inside the Democratic Republic of Congo that includes the Lamako Forest, Salonga National Park, and the long-term research site at Wamba. The river is the reason the species exists at all. Somewhere between 1 and 2 million years ago, the Congo's course shifted and cut an ancestral ape population off from the group that would become common chimpanzees on the northern bank. South of the river, without gorillas competing for the same fruiting trees and low-lying vegetation, the isolated population evolved down its own path. The outcome, after hundreds of thousands of generations, is an ape that looks almost identical to a chimpanzee to an untrained eye, roughly 70 to 86 pounds for an adult male, slightly smaller and more slender than a chimp, but one that runs its entire social world on a different operating system. In an ordinary week, a bonobo community of 30 to 60 animals splits into smaller foraging parties that drift across several square miles of forest, tracking fig trees and other seasonal fruit as it ripens. Unlike chimpanzee troops, where adult males form the core coalition that controls territory and food, bonobo society runs on bonds between unrelated females. Adult males average roughly 15% heavier and are individually stronger, and yet females hold the top ranks in the hierarchy almost everywhere the species has been studied. A single male, however large, rarely wins a dispute against 2 or 3 females acting together. That one fact, a sisterhood strong enough to outmuscle raw size, sets the terms for everything that follows once real competition for food begins. The system gets tested constantly because in this forest, food does not arrive evenly. A single strangler fig can hold enough ripe fruit to feed an entire community for one morning, and then nothing worth eating for days afterward. When 2 foraging parties converge on the same tree, or when a hungry subgroup returns to camp to find a smaller party already feeding, the setup is precisely the kind of resource squeeze that triggers fights, and at times killings, among chimpanzees at long-term study sites like Gombe and Mahale in Tanzania. Among bonobos, the identical setup triggers what researchers call sociosexual contact, brief, low-intensity sexual behavior, most often between females, used specifically to lower tension before a feeding conflict has the chance to escalate. It happens fast, it happens often, sometimes dozens of times in a single day across a community. And then it is over, and the group turns back to eating instead of fighting. The behavior is possible in the first place because of a specific anatomical trait. Female bonobos carry a clitoris that is unusually enlarged and positioned farther forward on the body than in almost any other primate, an adaptation that makes face-to-face genital contact between two females mechanically effective rather than incidental. Researchers studying the trait consider it one of the clearest documented cases of anatomy evolving specifically to support a social function, diffusing tension between unrelated females rather than reproduction itself. Push the test further, and the pattern still holds. An adolescent male at the edge of a feeding party sometimes tries to muscle in anyway, banking on his size advantage over any single female nearby. Field teams at Wamba have recorded exactly this kind of challenge, ending the same way almost every time. 2 or 3 females close ranks, a brief physical rebuff follows, and the male backs off within seconds, often screaming in protest, but never pressing the confrontation into a real fight. He gets a smaller share of the fruit that day. He does not get to rewrite the rule. The rule gets tested hardest by outsiders. Bonobo females leave their birth community around age 7 or 8 and transfer permanently into an unfamiliar group, arriving with no relatives, no allies, and no guaranteed welcome. A resident female could exclude her outright, and for the first days, that risk is real. Instead, over her opening weeks in a new community, the newcomer builds standing almost entirely through repeated genital contact with established females. Primatologist Takayoshi Kano, who began the first long-term bonobo field study at Wamba in 1973, tracked this integration process across years of daily observation, and there is a hard edge underneath the apparent calm. A female who fails to form these bonds stays marginal for the rest of her life in that group, feeding last, pushed to the thin edges of every good patch of fruit, effectively locked out of the alliance system that decides almost everything else. Males face a version of the same math, but they inherit it rather than build it, because a male bonobo's rank tracks his mother's rank almost exactly for as long as she is alive. Field researcher Barbara Fruth, working with Gottfried Hohmann at the Lomako and Louis Cotale sites, documented mothers physically intervening in their adult sons' disputes, breaking up fights the son was losing, and, in a handful of recorded cases, even interrupting a son's attempted mating, so her own social capital was not spent backing a pairing she had not sanctioned. A male whose mother dies while he is still young can lose status fast, sometimes permanently, in a system where his own physical strength barely registers next to whose daughter or whose son the rest of the community remembers him being. Then there is the narrower problem of 2 adult males wanting the same thing at the same moment, with no female coalition nearby to referee it. Field teams have recorded males performing their own version of the contact ritual, sometimes called rump rubbing or penis fencing in the primatology literature. Most often right after a tense standoff over a feeding spot, or after one male has displaced another from a good position in a tree. 2 males stand back to back or face to face and briefly press their genitals together, sometimes with a light rubbing motion before separating just as quickly. It resembles nothing in a chimpanzee's post-conflict repertoire, where reconciliation typically means cautious grooming at a careful distance, if it happens at all. Among bonobo males, the exchange is brief and nearly silent, and within seconds, both animals are back to foraging as if the standoff had cost them nothing. Even a hunt does not break the pattern the way it does in chimpanzee communities, where a successful kill of a colobus monkey can spark violent scrambles for meat among males. Bonobos hunt far less often, targeting small forest antelope called duikers and occasionally monkeys. And when a kill does happen, meat sharing tends to run through the same female-centered alliance network that governs everything else, with high-ranking females frequently controlling access to the carcass rather than the strongest male simply seizing it. The currency changes, the rule does not. The system is not free of real damage, and one documented case at Louis-Kotale makes that clear. A high-ranking adult male, pressing a claim against a coalition of females over access to a feeding tree, misjudged how far he could push and came away with a torn ear and deep bite wounds to his hand. Injuries serious enough that researchers tracking the community noted a visible drop in his body condition over the following weeks. He did not die. He did not lose his position outright. But for close to a month, he fed at the margins of his own group, waiting for the injuries to close and his standing to recover. Proof that the system still runs on real consequences, not choreography. What makes the case notable is not the injury itself, which would barely register in a chimpanzee study full of far worse outcomes, but the fact that researchers could single it out as unusual at all. In a community where lethal violence has never once been confirmed, even a torn ear becomes the most severe entry in the record. The habit starts long before an animal is old enough to need it for real leverage. Juvenile bonobos, some barely out of infancy, practice the same contact behavior constantly during play, tumbling together in the undergrowth in bouts that blend wrestling, chasing, and brief genital contact so thoroughly that field observers often cannot separate where the play ends and the bonding begins. Researchers at Wamba have logged these juvenile sessions running many times a day within a single travel party, far more frequently than the equivalent play fighting recorded in young chimpanzees at comparable sites. By the time a bonobo reaches sexual maturity, around age 8, the behavior is not a new tool picked up to handle adult stakes. It is a habit rehearsed for years, folded so completely into ordinary social life that using it to diffuse a real conflict later requires no new skill at all, only a shift in when the same old move gets deployed. Not every encounter resolves cleanly, and that is where the popular myth about this species tends to fall apart under real field data. It is tempting, after decades of headlines calling bonobos nature's pacifists, to assume conflict simply does not exist in their world. The record does not support that. Females compete hard for the best feeding positions and the highest-ranking allies. Adult males compete for access to fertile females and occasionally injure each other in the process, sometimes seriously. What has not turned up in roughly 50 years of continuous field research across multiple bonobo sites is a single confirmed case of one bonobo killing another. Compare that to chimpanzees, where anthropologist Richard Wrangham's cross-site data, compiled from decades of records at Gombe, Mahale, Kibale, and other long-term study locations, lists dozens of confirmed and inferred killings, most of them coalitions of adult males from one community ambushing and beating to death a male from a neighboring one. Both species share roughly 98.7% of their DNA with humans. Both sit equally close to us on the family tree. One of them has never, across half a century of continuous observation, been recorded killing its own kind. The discovery of just how different this species truly was took decades longer than it should have, because for the first years anyone examined a bonobo, nobody realized they were looking at a separate species at all. In 1929, German anatomist Ernst Schwarz was examining a chimpanzee skull at the Royal Museum for Central Africa in Tervuren, Belgium. and noticed its proportions did not match known chimpanzee skeletal material. He initially assumed he was looking at an unusually small juvenile chimp. Closer comparison convinced him otherwise, and Harold Coolidge formally described Pan paniscus as its own species in 1933, 4 years after Schwartz first flagged the discrepancy. For decades after that, almost nothing was known about how bonobos actually lived in the wild, because the remoteness and political instability of their range in the Congo made sustained fieldwork close to impossible. It was not until Kano's Wamba study began in the early 1970s that anyone documented, in real time and over consecutive years, exactly how a bonobo community managed tension without the violence recorded at every chimpanzee site up to that point. The finding did not stay confined to field notebooks, and it did not go unchallenged either. Primatologist Franz de Waal, working initially with captive groups, including the colony at the San Diego Zoo through the 1980s, was among the first to describe the pattern in terms that reached beyond academic journals, framing bonobo sociosexual behavior explicitly as a conflict management strategy, rather than simple reproductive activity. Several colleagues pushed back hard at the time, arguing that a handful of captive groups in artificial enclosures with unlimited food could not stand in for how wild bonobos actually behaved under real ecological pressure. That objection was reasonable, and it took the accumulating field data from Wamba, Lamako, and later Louis Cotelet, gathered across separate research teams over separate decades, to settle it. The wild data matched the captive observations closely enough that the skepticism eventually gave way. That process, contested claim tested against independent field evidence until it holds, is itself the reason the bonobo case carries real scientific weight rather than functioning as a feel-good headline. The pattern changed how an entire field discussed aggression in great apes, because it forced a question nobody had asked cleanly before. If two species this closely related can arrive at such different answers to the same daily problem of hungry, crowded animals competing for limited food, then violence in our closest relatives is not fixed by biology alone. It is a strategy, and strategies can be swapped for different ones. The common assumption, repeated in nature documentaries and casual conversation alike, is that our closest living relatives prove something grim and fixed about primate nature. That assumption is not built on nothing. It rests heavily on the chimpanzee fieldwork that reached the public first, especially Jane Goodall's decades of observation at Gombe, which included the so-called Gombe Chimpanzee War of the mid-1970s, when a splinter community was systematically hunted down and killed by its former allies over roughly 4 years. That story shaped public understanding of what our nearest relatives were like for a full generation before bonobo field data caught up in the public imagination. When de Waal published a widely read Scientific American article on the species in the mid-1990s, the label that stuck in press coverage was blunt shorthand, the so-called hippie chimp, an image that oversimplified the science just as badly in the other direction, suggesting a species with no competition at all, rather than one that simply rerouted competition away from lethal violence. That argument only survives if half the evidence gets left out. Bonobos share the same ancestry, comparable brain size relative to body mass, and similar tool-using intelligence, and they arrived at nearly the opposite solution to the identical evolutionary pressure of limited food and crowded territory. The myth is not wrong that a close relative of ours is capable of brutal, coordinated violence. It is wrong in assuming that is the only answer evolution produced from the same starting material. None of this makes bonobo life gentle in any sentimental sense. Status still decides who eats first and who eats last. Mothers who lose rank drag their sons down with them. Newcomer females who fail to build alliances in time spend years on the margins of every group they join. The cost of the system is paid constantly, in low-grade competition and near-constant social maintenance, not eliminated by it. What changed is where the cost gets paid. Chimpanzee society spends its currency in violence, sometimes lethal, patrolled borders and coordinated raids. Bonobo society spends the same currency in contact, alliance building, and a level of daily social labor that never quite stops. And in exchange, it appears to have priced out the kind of coordinated killing that defines chimpanzee politics at nearly every long-term study site on record. Back at the fruiting tree in the Lomako forest, the two groups that met as strangers an hour ago are still feeding together as the light starts to go gold through the canopy. A juvenile from one group and a juvenile from the other are chasing each other through the low branches, the kind of easy mixing that would be unthinkable between rival chimpanzee communities anywhere on the continent. By the time the sun drops below the canopy line, the two parties will likely split apart again, each returning to its own stretch of forest for the night. No blood spilled, no border defended by force. Somewhere in that same forest right now, in this exact dry season, another meeting like it is already underway, and the outcome is being decided, not by size, not by teeth, but by which animals know how to defuse a room before it ever gets the chance to explode.